Hello and welcome to Creative Photo Folk, the home of all things creative photography. In this week's tutorial, we'll be exploring both an in-camera and Photoshop technique to capture the passing of time with time slices. So time slices are created by taking several photos of the same subject over a period of time while ensuring that your camera does not move throughout. So let's first talk about how to do that. So basically, you'll want to find an interesting subject that's going to look good for this technique, and you'll want to be able to be there for a couple of hours shooting it over a period of time. You'll want your camera on a tripod so that it doesn't move, and you'll want it to be in a position where people aren't going to force you to move. So while I was at a fairly popular location, I was able to tuck my tripod in a corner that was out of the way, so I wasn't really bothered. Now, in finding a subject, you can usually use interesting buildings, pretty scenery, but ultimately you want something, ideally, that is going to light up when it turns into night, just to really sell this effect. So the first time I tested this, I did it with these buildings. Now the problem, I think, with this image is that the sun was directly behind these buildings. So it actually turned them into silhouettes, and it just doesn't look super interesting to me. So when finding a subject, probably try and avoid something that has the sun setting directly behind it. Now, this scenery is just to the right of this, so they are fairly close, but the sun was sort of setting over here rather than in this case where it was directly behind. So if you are finding this problem that the sun is setting behind your subject and putting it into silhouette, then you may want to instead shoot at sunrise. So there's just some things to think about. Now, taking these photos, this was kind of the first one. It was taken at about 4:30, and then I stayed till about 6:30. So it was about a 2-hour time period. You could go longer if you've got that luxury. Maybe you've got a great subject at your home, so you can just set it up and shoot all day. Now, the thing in shooting this technique is that it is going to get darker, so you do need to adjust your settings throughout. Now, when choosing what settings to use, I settled for an ISO of 100, an aperture of f8, and then a shutter speed of 1/60th, which I could get away with because it was on a tripod, but it was getting late into the afternoon, so there was still not quite a lot of light around, which is why that slower exposure. But as things darken, you are going to have to lengthen that exposure. And you also want to try and get a bit of drama in your image. So this one was great for the buildings, but there's no drama in the sky. So it's kind of a fine game of adjusting your settings so you are still getting some interest, but not kind of throwing everything into silhouette. So as it got darker, I started being 1/6 of a second, darker still, 0.6 of a second, even darker, 4 seconds, and I got a little bit of a cool light trail in that from a passing ferry. And then at the very end, we were sort of looking at 30 seconds. Now you'll notice that my aperture did not change throughout, and that is really important because you don't want the depth changing, you want the depth to stay the same, otherwise your pieces aren't going to kind of match up as well. So you're really only adjusting your shutter speed. So how to create a time slice? Well, the first thing you want to do is work out which images you want to use. So you want to get a nice progression. So you can kind of look through these and grab sort of maybe one from this little set, maybe one from this set, and you'll see that I've actually starred the ones that I ended up deciding to use. So you want to make it look enough of a progression to be different. So I was maybe taking them every, say, 3 minutes, and it does change quite quickly at this time of night. So once you've kind of narrowed it down to the images you want to use, so let's just sort those, you'll need to then count how many that you've got. I ended up using 12 in this image. You may have more, you may have less. I ended up only sort of using half of them because they were just a bit too similar. Like these are all too similar. So basically you will want to highlight all of those photos that you've chosen. So I clicked the first one and then shift clicked the final one. And then you would go to Photo, Edit In, and Open as Layers in Photoshop. So that's going to create a document which will be quite big because it's got a lot of photos inside it. So this is what it should look like. You'll have all your layers in order, and you'll ideally, because of the way that you've brought them in, they should progress from dark to light as you go down. So knowing that I was using 12 images, and this is why it's important to know beforehand, I will then go to View, Guides, and New Guide Layout. Now in here, we can create little segments. So in this case, I wanted to create 12 columns. So I just type 12 into that box and then we can hit OK. Now it's pretty easy. What we're going to do is select our marquee tool, making sure the rectangular one is selected. And then I will just draw around a segment. Now it will lock to each little pillar, which is really handy. And then highlighting my top one, I then add a layer mask. And so now we've just kept that portion and now we're seeing the layer underneath. And then we just keep doing that for every layer. So that was 2. Hardest thing really in this is just to remember what one you're up to. That's 3. And so then we've got our base image already done. And then we can go to View, Guides, and then Clear Guides. And then we can see what we've got. Now you may decide at this point to swap some around. You may decide to brighten or darken some. And if you do want to do that, I could highlight that layer. I could then click my adjustment layer icon and add a curves. And then I would clip it by holding down Alt or Option and clicking between the two so that it's now only affecting that layer. And I could make it darker, for example, or you could make it brighter if that's what you want to do. So this is kind of the interesting thing about this technique. You may not even have to shoot it over several hours. You could just change the exposure and the colors by going into here and playing with the other curves to make them the color you want. You could even get really crazy and experimental by putting like a rainbow of colors or something like that. That's what I love about this technique. There's a lot of diversity to play with. So that's something to think about. But there is a difference between this image and this image. So what you can actually do is then put a little bit of a shadow behind each scene to make the effect even more obvious. So the way to do that is you will highlight your first layer, you will double click it, you're going to click Drop Shadow. We want it to be multiply. Mine was set at 67%. You can play with your angle. It really doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but I had it set to 90. And you can see everything else I've got set there if you want to copy it, if yours isn't looking quite the same. And then I just hit OK. And then what I can do is right click and click Copy Layer Style, and then right click the next layer down and click Paste Layer Style. And you can do this for every single one. So now we have that applied to every layer. It's really quite a quick technique, which is cool. Now you'll notice this one is a little bit more kind of saturated and a bit warmer. So at the end I added some effects. So let's take a look at those. So I added a level. In here I've just brought in the highlights a little bit to brighten it up a touch. I have brought up the saturation a bit to make that more colorful. I have just slightly affected each color channel. I think that was just to make it a little bit warmer. And then finally I added a photo filter, and the photo filter is a warming filter. So I've added just an orange tinge at quite a low opacity, which just makes the whole thing a bit warmer. And so you could call it done there, but there are some other things you can do. So if you don't really like these very differentiated segments, then we can do kind of a time lapse. So let's talk about that. So this is what the time-lapse version looks like, which I think looks really cool too. But let me show you how to do this instead. Basically, this time you will add your layer mask and then you're going to use your gradient tool. So you access your gradient tool with G. It also looks like this one here. I noticed something about this yesterday. They've changed this in Photoshop recently. So you have to choose classic gradient from this little box here. Otherwise it doesn't work properly. I'm not sure what that's about. And then if you click in this box, you can choose basics. And then this very first one called foreground to background, which should be black to white. If it's not, you will just have to press D to reset yours to a default and then go and choose it again. So it does help to have done that other stage first. Let's actually just take a look at that. Now, I just realized I've got the wrong gradient selected. You want this one here, which is the linear gradient. So with our little segment selected, remember to turn off these drop shadows before we start. Cool thing about this is you can see people walking on the bridge. Let me show you. I was very excited by that, but you actually can't really see it in the final image. Now, if you do want to see your segments so you know exactly where to draw your gradient, just go through and shift click each of your layer masks so that they turn off. And then we can start at the top and draw across that one to soften it. Then we will shift click it again to turn it back on, making sure that the right one is clicked. And then we can shift click this one so we can see where it needs to be, making sure the right one is selected. Shift click, select it. And still got a drop shadow on, so turn that off. So you'll probably want to play around with some of these a bit more. That was just a really quick job. So that's how you do the time-lapse version. But the other cool thing you can try is not using strips. You can use shapes. So let's take a look at some of those. So then I created this version where I actually use squares instead, and I use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So not too many. I just picked the ones that had the kind of coolest colors and did the same thing. I used my marquee tool to create a box, and then I made that the layer mask, and then I made them progressively bigger. I can't draw boxes right now, but that's what I did, as you can see on the layer masks. So that's what they look like. Did apply the drop shadow again, but then I didn't really like this bright bit in the center, so I actually removed it and did this one, which only has 4 boxes, which I think looks quite cool as well. Then I started playing around and I actually just removed the bottom of the boxes under the bridge, so it's just on the top. You don't have to use boxes, so go to the marquee tool and you could use circles instead. So if you click the elliptical marquee tool and change it to fixed ratio, you can draw circles. Now the problem with this is it's kind of, you'll just be really guessing how big they need to be, and as you draw them you can hold down spacebar to reposition them where you want. So that's something you could do, and they don't even have to be the same size. You could put a circle here and a square here and whatever, you know, there's lots to play with here, depending really on the subject you've got and the variations that will look cool together. So yeah, it's a pretty easy and straightforward technique, but there's a lot of experimenting you can do here. You could go to the lasso tool and select the polygonal lasso tool and create your own shapes. You could do sort of diagonals, or you could do rays. Ooh, and I just discovered this other cool thing you can do. So if we turn off some of these layers and I go to my shape tool, I didn't even know you could do this, and I will go to custom shape, and then up here you can choose some shapes. So I'll choose, say, this boat. And if I am on a layer mask, let's say this one, I can draw in this shape and it makes a layer mask of that shape. So that's a world of fun to play with. Making sure that layer mask is highlighted, you can draw it in. You can hold down Shift as you do it. Look at that, oh my god. Inventing things on the fly. I would definitely be playing with that again, but obviously you'd want to do it on something a little bit less busy. This technique is not only great for capturing the progression of time, but can also be used for other creative collages, like juxtaposing similar shapes or comparing different faces. So come show me what art you create over in our Facebook group. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe for many more creative photography ideas and tutorials. Thanks for watching and happy creating!